Between November 8th and 10 of 1890, 3 brothers from Langston Township were reported missing under identical circumstances. Though located separately, each site held elements too similar to be explained by accident. An inquiry was initiated by local officials, but by the time the first formal report was completed, a larger state-level agency had intervened. Their findings were immediately classified. Today, only one document remains unsealed, a handwritten observation log from the township's contracted physician containing 27 entries made during the brothers' final days. Langston Township, located in northern Indiana, was widely regarded as a model of structured rural development. By 1887, it had earned recognition from the State Surveyor's Office for its advanced water system, rotating school staff, and an unusual pilot program that granted select families access to controlled agricultural research tools. The Langston brothers, 3 adult siblings employed within this pilot initiative, were locally viewed as methodical, reliable, and reserved. Their residence was often cited in news circulars as an example of scientific progress through community cooperation. At the time, no indication existed that their work had drawn any negative attention. In the late spring of 1889, a routine inspection from the Office of Township Coordination evaluated Langston's agricultural facilities and flagged several discrepancies in paperwork related to experimental crop yields. The findings were minor and attributed to clerical backlog. The Langston brothers, Ellis, Bernard, and Simon, submitted their updates within the week, and the matter was closed with a formal commendation. The brothers, known for their precision, had never received a negative audit in their 5 years under the program. They maintained independent records, submitted samples ahead of schedule, and logged their results using pre-printed templates issued by the Agricultural Methods Evaluation Board. The Langston Initiative was unlike others in the state. Funded by a blend of township levies and a federal improvement grant, the program provided eligible participants with advanced tools, controlled fertilizer variants, and access to untested seed types. The brothers were among the first to join when the pilot began in 1884. According to archived evaluations, their property was deemed optimal for longitudinal data collection due to its steady temperature gradients and minimal slope variation. Ellis, the eldest, managed soil inputs and was responsible for instrument calibration. He had trained under a civil inspector in Jefferson County and brought an engineer's discipline to his work. Bernard oversaw rotation schedules, pest inspection, and manual labor coordination. Simon, the youngest, handled correspondence, shipment intake, and chemical compound logs. While their work required minimal outside contact, each brother was known to maintain cordial relationships with district staff and the Langston Supply Depot. There were no disciplinary incidents or flagged communications across their 5 years of enrollment. The property itself sat at the southeastern edge of Langston Township, where township boundaries intersected with non-incorporated farmland. It was a permitted zone for experimental farming because of its documented flood stability and moderate clay density. The brothers had partitioned their acreage into 12 test fields, each bounded by post and wire enclosures. Instrument towers were visible from the road, but not open to public inspection. According to a late 1888 field memo, one of these towers had been upgraded with a dual barometer casing and redirected drainage. The modification was considered significant enough to trigger a visit from the state's agricultural methodology director, who cleared the structure and closed the report with a handwritten note stating, "Systematic and clean, minimal human error risk." Local documentation from the Langston Township Record Office indicates that the brothers received quarterly shipments marked under a coded internal registry. These included sealed test materials, laminated charts, and occasionally glass vials marked with both date and lot number. According to surviving inventory entries, the final 4 shipments before the brothers' absence arrived with irregular timing. The September delivery, dated the 12th, was 5 days late and contained double the standard number of vials. The October shipment was missing its compound manifest and arrived without the usual instruction folio. These discrepancies were acknowledged in township logs but marked as corrected internally. What remains most unusual about this period is not the missing paperwork, but the absence of any complaint or inquiry filed by the brothers themselves. Every participant in the Langston pilot program was instructed to report inconsistencies within 72 hours of detection. The Langston brothers, until that point, had filed 6 such notices over the years, each concise, correctly formatted, and usually submitted before the township clerk's office had opened for the day. The lack of follow-up regarding the October irregularity was flagged retroactively by the Oversight Board, but no internal investigation was opened. In terms of reputation, the brothers were considered unusually insular but dependable. Ellis had not been seen in the main square since early 1887, though his signature appeared monthly in township receipts. Bernard frequented the toolshed co-op, but avoided public events. Simon, the only one known to speak regularly with visiting evaluators, had become the de facto liaison between their household and external agencies. His handwriting, notably small and angular, appears in all surviving logbooks. A clerk from the Langston field office, whose name was redacted in later summaries, noted that Simon's last 3 correspondences were written using mismatched ink and contained unusually high repetition of numeric groupings. Langston's pilot program operated under a policy of reduced in-person contact to preserve test purity, especially during chemical trial months. Participants were not required to attend township functions, vote in elections, or even register civil grievances in person. All official communication flowed through a centralized file drop near the depot entrance, monitored by 2 clerks on rotating shifts. Any message placed in the drop was sorted, dated and copied into a quarterly bulletin. In November of 1890, the bulletin contained no entries from the Langston property for the entire month prior. This gap was the first noted anomaly during routine document consolidation. According to a statement later issued by the Langston Clerk Office, the missing entries were initially attributed to a clerical misrouting. It wasn't until November 9, 1890, that a formal notice was issued requesting an on-site verification. A field officer was dispatched that afternoon, arriving shortly after 3:45 p.m. His notes, partially retained in a supplemental ledger, described the approach to the property as quiet, gate unsecured, instruments active. The field perimeter showed no signs of entry or damage, and the livestock shed contained recently stirred feed. However, all 3 residential access doors were locked from within. A 4th entrance, connected to the sample holding chamber, was open but blocked by a storage cart. The officer's full account was never included in township files, but a partial summary remains. It states that upon entering the sample room, the officer found logged entries consistent with October dates, all filed in sequential order. The final log, dated October 28th, was signed SL, and contained only a 6-digit numerical string followed by the words, "under test." No test designation or instrument data was listed. By evening, the field officer had contacted his supervisor in Jefferson County and requested temporary holding authority to inspect the residence. This request was marked received, but not approved. Instead, instructions were given to secure the outer perimeter and await higher clearance. Overnight logs show that 2 additional clerks were dispatched to maintain surveillance from the field gate. No movement was recorded during their watch. Public knowledge of the Langston brothers' disappearance was delayed by over a week. The official announcement was posted on November 17th, citing non-compliance with internal reporting. Local residents, upon hearing the news, expressed confusion but little alarm. Most had not seen the brothers for months, and the nature of the program discouraged unannounced visits. A single letter submitted by a neighboring farmer to the Langston Weekly Gazette noted that he had observed lights in the northwest greenhouse at irregular hours, but had assumed it was part of a scheduled test. No further activity was documented at the Langston property until November 20th, when access was granted to a regional supervisory board. They arrived with 2 cataloguing assistants and a sealed inventory case. Their task was to produce an environmental assessment and determine if protocol failures had occurred. Within 4 hours of entry, the assessment was placed under restricted status and removed from local records. Fay placeholder summary was inserted, citing equipment failure and ambiguous residence conditions. The Supervisory Board's initial findings, as referenced in a supplemental field memo, identified no breaches to the external structure of the Langston residence. The equipment inside was fully intact, and test vials were organized by type and rotation period. The Western Observation Station had been fitted with an unauthorized mirror device affixed to the base of the primary barometric mast. This addition had not been approved in any prior permit requests, but appeared functional and undamaged. A note was made that the mirror's position would have reflected late afternoon light directly into the eastern study room window for approximately 73 minutes each day. The cataloging assistants, both trained in environmental diagnostics, documented ambient temperature, particle density, and electrical conductivity in each room. All measurements fell within expected rural parameters, except for the humidity index in the upper sleeping quarters. Their levels were reported to fluctuate beyond standard tolerances by as much as 9% within 10-minute intervals. No cause was determined, though inspectors noted that the room's windows had been sealed with resin and showed signs of prior reinforcement. The room contained a single cot, a closed ledger, and a non-functional air modulation fan. The ledger's entries stopped on October 22nd and consisted primarily of abbreviated chemical notations. During their second inspection cycle, the board discovered a locked cabinet behind the compound storage wall. The unit, made of reinforced cedar with no visible hinges, required disassembly of the adjacent shelving to access. Inside were 2 full inventory books, both unlisted in previous reports. These books did not match any state-issued template and had been formatted manually using grid stamps. Contents included alternate lot identifiers and a parallel compound classification system not found in the Agricultural Methods Evaluation Board's archives. It appeared that the Langston brothers had maintained an independent evaluation process alongside the mandated protocols. The Supervisory Board submitted a written request for interpretive assistance and sealed the books until further analysis could be completed. Communication between the township and the Supervisory Board was limited following the November 20th inspection. All follow-up reports were redirected through a state liaison assigned to Jefferson County. Local officials, including the township registrar and sanitation coordinator, were no longer permitted entry to the Langston property. The area was reclassified under a temporary rural preservation ordinance, citing unstable foundations and the need for groundwater containment. The ordinance remained in place until March of the following year. In a transcript dated November 24th, a member of the Regional Oversight Committee presented the initial findings to the Agricultural Grant Coordinator. The meeting notes reference classification divergence and protocol deviation exceeding acceptable boundaries. It was suggested that the Langston brothers may have adopted their own indexing system to test compound variance without prior authorization. The committee, however, found no evidence of data falsification or fraudulent activity. Rather, the brothers' modifications indicated a higher than expected familiarity with compound stability metrics, raising concerns about their access to unauthorized instruction or materials. This point led to a broader inquiry into the origin of the Langston program's supply chain. Between 1885 and 1888, compound shipments had been documented and verified by township clerks. However, after the program's third-year renewal, oversight of these shipments transitioned to a separate contractor, whose records were not preserved in the local archive. This gap in accountability complicated efforts to trace the contents of the final 4 deliveries made to the Langston property. Without corresponding instruction manuals or barcode equivalencies, most vials could not be confidently identified. As part of the internal review, the Supervisory Board compiled a control inventory based on residue analysis. Samples were extracted under observation and categorized using reagent density readings. 3 compound groups were successfully matched to early-stage germination agents, consistent with the intended scope of the Langston initiative. However, 2 compound groups exhibited behavior outside documented ranges, including variance in diffusion rate and thermal reactivity. A third group, found in a separate tray beneath the holding platform, showed no reaction to the standard index protocols and was labeled non-responsive. This designation was used when a substance could not be activated, dissolved or bonded using established methods. A subsequent memo from the Jefferson County Science Review Board recommended that all unidentified compounds be removed and archived at a central facility. This recommendation was implemented on December 2nd, with a transport vehicle arriving under a closed manifest. Township staff were not notified of the operation, and no records of the transport route remain. When township clerks attempted to re-establish their authority over the Langston records, they were informed that the program had entered administrative re-evaluation and would remain under state review indefinitely. By late December, public interest in the Langston property had grown, though few concrete details were available. A printed notice in the Langston Weekly Gazette invited readers to submit inquiries through a formal petition process. 17 petitions were received, most requesting clarity on the program's future and the whereabouts of the Langston brothers. These were acknowledged but not answered directly. Instead, a single-column update was published, reiterating that the pilot initiative was under re-evaluation and that all participants were under review for protocol adherence. No mention was made of absence, disappearance, or disqualification. In early January, township maintenance staff were permitted to resume water system inspections within a limited radius of the Langston property. According to internal records, the primary drainage conduit located near the southern perimeter had been rerouted. This modification, noted in an inspection form dated January 3rd, was not approved by any known civil engineer or local agency. The rerouting diverted runoff through a ceramic-lined channel leading to an unmarked outflow point, approximately 100 feet beyond the property boundary. Soil samples collected along this channel showed elevated mineral content consistent with chemical filtration. The channel was later capped and backfilled under state order. The final official mention of the Langston brothers appears in a February report submitted to the Agricultural Methods Evaluation Board. The report, authored by a project liaison whose name was later redacted, classified the brothers as unavailable for continued study. No cause or context was provided. The report was accepted into the record without amendment or objection. On the same date, the Langston property was removed from the experimental zoning map and relabeled as a conservation area. No new occupants were authorized. The cumulative effect of these decisions was the quiet removal of the Langston brothers from all official documentation related to the pilot program. Their names ceased to appear in grant renewals, supply logs, or outreach correspondence. The township, lacking jurisdiction, was unable to pursue further inquiry. Residents were told that the property had served its purpose and would be preserved as a site of scientific legacy. Public access was never reinstated. As of 1895, the land remained unused, its perimeter marked by a thin line of administrative fencing and a weathered placard bearing only a program code. Clerks who had previously handled Langston files were reassigned. The township depot, once responsible for coordinating materials, transitioned to general supply distribution and was renamed to reflect its broader function. Inside the depot's central archive, the Langston file drawer was sealed with a thin lacquer strip, labeled Finalized. Before the Langston Township program shifted to state control, subtle irregularities had already begun appearing in the operational logs submitted by nearby pilot sites. These sites, while not physically adjacent to the Langston brothers' property, shared the same quarterly distribution schedules and identical compound inventories. A discrepancy first noted in August 1890 involved a compound variant mislabeled in a September shipment routed through District 7, affecting a family-run site 5 miles northeast of Langston. The error was flagged by a participant, corrected in the next dispatch and marked as resolved. However, internal memos show that the same lot code later appeared in the Langston delivery manifest 2 weeks after the issue had supposedly been addressed. The reused lot code would not have raised concern on its own, but accompanying materials had been printed using a discontinued stencil format. That stencil, last used in mid-1888, had been retired due to legibility concerns and replaced with a new identification system issued by the Agricultural Methods Evaluation Board. The reappearance of that format suggested one of two possibilities. Either archived materials had been reissued in error, or unauthorized printing had occurred outside approved facilities. There is no indication that this anomaly was ever communicated to the Langston brothers, nor is there any record of it being reported to them. Elsewhere in township files, a technician from the regional storage facility filed a maintenance request involving temperature inconsistencies in one of the chemical preservation vaults. The entry, dated September 14th, noted that one of the refrigeration coils had failed intermittently, allowing ambient warmth to reach the compound trays. According to protocol, any affected compounds were to be withdrawn and reassessed. No withdrawal was recorded for that week, though an inventory gap in the September manifest coincides with a compound classification range identical to those later recovered from the Langston property. This mismatch went unaddressed until after the closure of the property. Within Langston Township itself, local technicians working at the Southern Relay Station began encountering data transmission inconsistencies during field synchronizations. Between September 25th and October 3rd, 3 such misalignments were logged, each involving atmospheric readings taken from the southeastern sector where the Langston property was located. The station's lead operator noted that the barometric readings differed slightly from adjacent stations, even though calibration across the district had been performed the previous week. No fault was found in the equipment, and the anomaly was written off as terrain-induced variation. However, a 4th reading taken on October 5th indicated a sharp inversion of the humidity profile over a 30-minute interval. No external weather event could account for the change, and no comparable reading was observed in other sectors. The data was forwarded to the Township Coordination Center, where it was tagged with an observation code for internal review. The review was scheduled for late October, but cancelled following the redirection of all Langston-related activity to the state level. The file containing the inversion log remains incomplete, with the final page of calculations left blank and the clerk's initials missing. Simultaneously, a separate irregularity emerged in the township's rotational field inspections. Although the Langston brothers had not received an official visit since March 1890, routine flyover assessments using tethered aerostats were still conducted monthly to verify structural compliance. In October, the imagery report filed by the Langston survey balloon operator included 6 plates instead of the usual 4. 2 plates were marked as reprints due to lens glare, but upon review, a note in the clerk margin suggests that the additional images showed surface irregularities in test field 12. Field 12, used for compound exposure trials, had been scheduled for deactivation that season and was presumed inactive. The images, which were archived under a general visual log and not flagged for special review, showed a faint overlay in the northern quadrant of the field resembling surface deposition. Without any formal test scheduled, the presence of new material was unexpected. Township records contain no follow-up on this observation, and the plates were later moved to a general storage folder unrelated to the Langston file. While these scattered observations did not trigger formal concern at the time, they collectively reflect a period of diminished oversight during the program's final months. The experimental framework had been designed to operate with minimal interference, and much of the township's record-keeping was optimized for bulk processing rather than detailed individual review. Any isolated anomaly, no matter how specific, had to compete with hundreds of other entries for attention. Unless corroborated by multiple sources, most discrepancies were handled through clerical annotation rather than direct intervention. In this context, the physician's logbook, found weeks later among the few surviving documents from the Langston site, gains new significance. Its entries began on October 15th and continued daily until November 8th. Though unsigned, the log was traced to the township's contracted medical observer, a position tasked with monitoring physiological impacts among participants of the compound trials. The observer was not based in Langston, but visited test sites periodically under a non-public schedule. The log's early entries note routine assessments. Vital markers were recorded in shorthand, and entries reference identifiable initials matching the Langston brothers. Notably, the entries suggest that all 3 subjects were present during the initial observations. The recorded markers include respiration intervals, pulse notation, and compound exposure rotation. Each line is dated and consistent with prior observation methods used during similar pilot initiatives across the state. Beginning October 23rd, the log shifts in format. Standard vital assessments are replaced by abbreviated codes without corresponding values. The observer notes changes in participant response timing and records adjustments in compound dosage that are not reflected in any official instruction manual. Entry 16 contains a marginal note referencing mirror rotation, a phrase that appears again in entries 19 and 24. No explanation is provided, and the term does not appear in any known agricultural or medical manual of the period. The log's final entry, dated November 8th at 7:40 p.m., contains no vital markers or procedural notes. It consists only of a 7-digit numerical sequence, followed by a double underline. The page following this entry is blank, and no further observations were recorded. Township staff, upon retrieving the log, placed it in a sealed folder marked Auxiliary, which was later submitted with the initial inventory recovered from the property. Records from other pilot participants during this period suggest that no similar observation logs were maintained elsewhere. The presence of such a log, written in a consistent hand and using recognized notation, supports the conclusion that regular oversight of the Langston brothers continued later than previously assumed. However, without corroborating entries from the supervising physician, whose appointment concluded officially in mid-October, the provenance of the final entries remains undetermined. At least one township official, reviewing the log before its classification, wrote a provisional note suggesting that the physician may have remained at the site longer than required, possibly to monitor unreported symptoms. This note was never expanded, and no further correspondence from the physician exists in the recovered files. Another subtle indicator of irregular oversight appears in the township's transportation manifest for October. On October 27th, an unauthorized vehicle was recorded passing through Checkpoint 4, the access gate nearest to the Langston perimeter. While occasional private traffic was not unusual, checkpoint logs required all vehicles to declare origin and purpose. The driver of the vehicle signed only with the initials AJ and listed no affiliation. The entry was marked as pass-through, with a duration of 12 minutes inside the restricted corridor. No materials were listed as delivered or received. This checkpoint log was later examined during the review of the Langston timeline, but no connection was formally made. Still, the date places the visit just 1 day before the last log entry from the Langston site and 3 days before the initial report of absence. Following the discovery of the unsigned checkpoint entry, township clerks attempted to cross-reference the initials with vehicle authorization records stored in the Jefferson County transit log. No match was found. The ledger for that day lists no personnel with matching initials and no visitors scheduled under any provisional work order. As a precaution, the clerk overseeing gate records requested a mechanical inspection of the checkpoint's ink plate to verify authenticity. The ink used in the entry corresponded to the official registry, confirming the record had not been altered or added later. The incident was internally labeled as a low-priority breach and not escalated beyond the transportation office. However, the proximity of the entry to the end of observable activity at the Langston site later caused it to be flagged in a supplemental review conducted by the township's data compliance officer. That officer's report, which was prepared in February 1891 and never submitted to state officials, notes that while no evidence of tampering was found, the 12-minute duration of the visit would have been sufficient to access the sample. Repository or instrument shack. The report ends with a handwritten notation, log ends too soon to confirm intention. Unrelated to the checkpoint anomaly, but occurring within the same 2-week period, was an equipment fault reported by the Langston Meteorological Relay Tower, located 5 miles west of the experimental zone. The relay tower transmitted atmospheric data hourly to the Jefferson County record grid. On November 2nd, a disruption occurred that interrupted signal transmission for 27 minutes. A field technician dispatched to investigate found no mechanical fault, but reported unexplained power draw from the relay's auxiliary battery system. The power level dropped by 9% during the outage and returned to baseline without intervention. A secondary battery, installed as backup, remained at full charge. The incident was documented and attributed to faulty wiring, although no physical damage to the lines was observed. Of note is that during the power draw, 3 brief pulses were registered on the tower's signal node, each spaced 6 minutes apart. These pulses did not correspond to any scheduled transmission and did not match the waveform profile used in regular data syncing. The tower's logbook referred to the pulses as unassigned bursts, a designation used when input signals are received but do not conform to known patterns. There is no recorded attempt to align the pulses with any event at the Langston property. At the time, data from the experimental zone had already been rerouted to a central archive under state review, making cross-referencing unavailable to township technicians. However, the technician's summary report includes an observation that the direction of signal interference originated from the east, consistent with the Langston area. Elsewhere in the township, a sequence of unrelated maintenance tasks was quietly deferred during the first week of November. These included scheduled inspections of water towers, barn silos, and drainage intake valves across the southern perimeter. Internal memos from the township office suggest that clerks were instructed to limit field activity during that window due to a temporary reclassification of the Langston sector. The reclassification was justified under a clause permitting restricted access during chemical rotation finalization. Though that clause had rarely been enacted, it provided legal authority to suspend routine presence near the site. This administrative pause coincided with a lack of observable agricultural output from the Langston brothers' fields. Township co-op data from the same period shows no inbound produce, no tool requisitions, and no field updates between October 29th and November 11th. Though pilot programs allowed for non-reporting periods during inclement weather or compound transition cycles, such conditions were not present during that interval. A field intake assistant noted the gap during a ledger review, but was informed the omission was being handled at the supervisory level. In late November, a separate clerical office located outside Langston, but tasked with tabulating regional participation statistics, compiled an updated map of compound utilization across the northern pilot corridor. On the map, each parcel was marked according to activity level and inventory receipt. All parcels were color-coded based on input ratios, save for the Langston property, which was left blank with a notation reading pending revision. The draft map, which was not distributed publicly, was circulated to the Jefferson County Data Board for verification. The omission of the Langston zone was noted, but not corrected. Additional signs of operational ambiguity can be seen in communications from the Sample Transport Division. Records from the third quarter of 1890 indicate that the Langston shipment route had undergone quiet rerouting. Instead of passing through the standard channel used by surrounding properties, the Langston compounds were reassigned to a direct transfer line ending at an interim depot outside Auburn Hills. This depot, managed independently by a contracted courier firm, was designated for transitional inventory but not listed in official pilot program documentation. No participant files reference it, and its role was later removed from the consolidated route directory during a system-wide audit in mid-1891. When asked in a post-program interview about this rerouting, a regional logistics officer stated that the interim depot had been a temporary measure to ease seasonal congestion. No further explanation was provided. The depot's location was subsequently removed from distribution maps, and all compound inventories rerouted to standard processing. Another notable omission involves the participation surveys collected in late 1890. Each pilot program participant was expected to submit an anonymized feedback form at year's end. These surveys assessed equipment performance, delivery reliability, and procedural clarity. Of the 34 properties active in the corridor, 32 forms were received and processed. 2 were missing. One belonged to a participant who had formally withdrawn in August. The other was assigned to the Langston property. No substitute form or follow-up communication was ever logged. The absence was marked unrecoverable in the survey summary file. One final file, kept in a storage compartment adjacent to the Langston Township Review Desk, contained raw weather data for November 7 through 9, collected from instruments in surrounding parcels. Among the compiled entries was a handwritten chart from a co-monitoring property located 9 miles northeast of Langston. That chart includes a notation of a localized drop in air density, spanning 35 minutes between 4 and 4:35 a.m. on November 9th. The density change was not mirrored in any other sector and was initially assumed to be an instrument fault. However, when the chart was resubmitted during a routine archive review in April 1891, the data was re-entered and flagged with a note reading, "Isolated but measurable." The individual who submitted that chart, a technician affiliated with the Northern Sampling Wing, was later reassigned to a non-agricultural program outside the county. No follow-up notes were added to the file. The chart remains stored in the regional archive with no identifying marks beyond the location coordinates. By early 1891, most clerical staff involved with the Langston files had rotated out of their assignments. The documentation that remained was gradually merged into broader agricultural record logs, and the pilot program's assets were reallocated to other townships. The data recorded during the final weeks of Langston's activity was either excluded from future summaries or referenced without source attribution. No official audit of that period was conducted, and all remaining inquiries were redirected to a closed internal registry under state jurisdiction. The eventual reclassification of the Langston property as a conservation site did not immediately halt internal efforts to reconcile inconsistencies in the program's documentation. Within the Jefferson County Agricultural Coordination Bureau, a subset of technicians continued informal reviews of decommissioned sites. This process, authorized under an archival quality assurance directive, allowed former evaluators to examine legacy materials not under active dispute, but flagged with procedural ambiguities. By March 1891, at least 3 Langston-related entries had entered this review queue, each involving inventory discrepancies, shipment anomalies, and equipment deviations. One such file, indexed under Control Code 647D, detailed a shipment of calibration rods sent to the Langston brothers in August 1890. The rods, used to align measurement devices within soil assessment towers, were stamped with an incorrect thermal indicator. A clerk flagged the anomaly when the recorded melting point failed to align with the standard field reference. Follow-up notes indicate the rods were never returned or replaced. Without confirmation of use or disposal, the file was closed under a procedural deferral clause, yet it remained visible in the technician queue due to its unresolved status. A second flagged file involved duplicated entries in the township's equipment replacement ledger. 2 separate requests, both marked under the same authorization code, listed a failed compound balance scale requiring immediate substitution. The equipment in question was typically issued in single-unit quantities and had a serial number traceable to a central catalog. However, in this case, both replacement orders listed identical justification text and identical delivery destinations, spaced only 4 days apart. No indication exists that the first replacement was defective, nor is there evidence the second request was rejected. Both were processed, fulfilled, and removed from active inventory. The documentation surrounding this event was minimal, and the redundant request remained unexplained. The third file reviewed during this period pertained to a correspondence anomaly involving a co-monitoring station located west of Langston. Between October 30th and November 2nd, the station's outbound transmissions ceased briefly and then resumed with altered protocol headers. Instead of the assigned sector code, the messages included an outdated prefix associated with an earlier data framework retired the previous year. While this anomaly would not typically raise concern, the prefix in question had only been used in one other known instance. A message from a Langston-affiliated account sent in July 1889. The reuse of a deprecated header indicated that either archived message templates had been inadvertently reinstated or that station operators had reverted to old input protocols. Either case suggested irregular control of standard communication procedures. These 3 files, while technically minor, carried weight in aggregate. By April, a technician at the County Bureau initiated a provisional cross-reference review between the Langston pilot logs and peripheral system failures across the region. Though not officially sanctioned as an investigation, the action resulted in the identification of 5 additional inconsistencies linked temporally to the Langston site. Each involved unscheduled maintenance, unfiled reports, or undocumented substitutions in compound containers. The technician's notes, preserved in the archive, outline a timeline beginning in mid-September 1890 and ending abruptly with the final compound transfer from the Langston site in early December. Notably, these observations led to the recovery of a single backup registry disk, stored in a compartment mislabeled as part of the seed catalog archive. The disk, a circular card used to record encoded data from rotary dial instruments, contained chemical exposure logs from an adjacent pilot property. Though not directly connected to Langston, the disk captured external readings during the final days of the Langston program's operation. The timestamps on the disk coincide with the last confirmed activity within the Langston sample shed. What drew particular interest was a brief sequence of data showing abrupt shifts in internal chamber temperature on November 7th. The readings indicate a downward spike of 11 degrees over a 12-minute period, followed by immediate normalization. Such a profile would typically suggest mechanical failure, yet no fault was later found in the adjacent property's systems. A reanalysis conducted weeks later confirmed the accuracy of the data, and the disk was labeled as containing valid peripheral fluctuations. The technician who reviewed the entry noted the alignment with other anomalies recorded during the same window. The technician filed a provisional recommendation that the disk be included in the next review cycle for unarchived program materials. However, before that cycle began, the technician was reassigned to administrative duties and the recommendation remained unsigned. The disk was placed in a sealed envelope and added to the general Langston file with no further comment. At the same time, clerical staff in the township's auxiliary storage unit discovered a logbook misfiled within a drawer labeled Equipment Rotation. The book, bound in twine and bearing no official insignia, contained a detailed account of soil moisture levels and nutrient concentration intervals for test field 11. Entries were dated sporadically between July and October 1890 and written in a style consistent with prior Langston reports. However, several entries include annotation marks unlike any known township shorthand. A notation resembling an arc, followed by a diagonal stroke, appears next to multiple compound identifiers. No key was found to interpret the marks, and the log was forwarded to the Jefferson County Archive for further examination. While reviewing the annotations, an assistant within the Soil Sciences Division noted that the marked compounds aligned with shipment codes that had appeared only once in the Langston delivery history. These were compounds introduced under a special exemption for targeted exposure tests. The exemption allowed for unlisted substances to be trialed under sealed protocol, provided results were submitted within 48 hours of activation. However, no such reports were found for the identified compounds. The assistant filed a low-level inquiry request, which was received and acknowledged but not answered. The cumulative impact of these discoveries was the quiet expansion of Langston's file category from resolved to pending quality audit. The classification carried no enforcement mechanism, but enabled regional offices to reopen Langston-related materials without triggering jurisdictional disputes. Within 3 weeks of the change, at least 4 internal memos made reference to Langston datasets in broader program reviews. These references were non-specific and did not name the Langston brothers individually, but they marked the first time in over a year that the property's information had been used to inform procedural adjustments. One such adjustment involved the calibration intervals for barometric sensors in isolated test sites. A memo issued in June 1891 cited signal echo inconsistencies discovered during retrospective analysis of compound integration zones. The recommendation, drafted by an equipment oversight coordinator, proposed reducing recalibration intervals from 6 months to 4 in all sites where data drift had been observed. Though Langston was not named, a footnote references field instruments identical to those documented at the Langston property. Elsewhere in the region, similar procedural changes emerged. A control chart used to log compound shelf life was modified to include a conditional variance column based on indirect thermal influence, a parameter not included in the original framework. The revision was sourced to a reanalysis of peripheral exposure data, again coinciding with the Langston closure window. While no public acknowledgement connected these adjustments to the Langston case, internal indexing placed the relevant documentation within the same archive block. By late summer 1891, most discussions of Langston within official correspondence had shifted to the level of procedural reference. No direct inquiries remained open, and all personnel previously assigned to Langston oversight had been reassigned. However, the data and irregularities associated with the site continued to influence archival procedure, equipment rotation schedules, and compound variance tolerances across the Northern Agricultural Corridor. On September 5, 1891, a technician from the Jefferson County Compound Audit Team submitted a summary note describing a pattern of unmatched exposure intervals within a limited cluster of pilot participants. The Langston brothers were not named in the note, but one of the flagged entries listed an observation timestamp corresponding to a compound delivery recorded in Langston's shipment log. The technician included a comparison chart showing a deviation in response index beginning 48 hours after compound intake. The anomaly, while minor, was replicated in 3 separate field notes attached to sites that had received similarly classified materials. At that time, compound grouping was transitioning to a standardized identification code, meaning that earlier shipments carried legacy labels not easily traceable across site inventories. This hindered efforts to verify overlap without reprocessing raw intake records. In the technician's analysis, the chart labeled Group C7 showed an onset deviation duration that began just after the final confirmed Langston intake and persisted through a region-wide data silence that extended for nearly 72 hours. Though no causality was implied, the technician noted that this time frame corresponded precisely with a reduction in compound yield across several parcels monitored by the Auburn Hills Transitional Depot. The Auburn Hills Depot, though previously involved in the Langston shipment reroute, was no longer listed in active transportation schedules by fall 1891. Yet the technician's files revealed an unmarked transit form with partial lot identifiers matching those from Langston's inventory. These identifiers appeared in a handwritten margin on a recalibration worksheet stored with secondary warehouse documentation. No transport date or delivery recipient was indicated. A field notation beside the margin read, "Non-synchronized return," a phrase used to denote the re-entry of materials outside standard archival cycle. The worksheet was not submitted into formal record, but retained within a review envelope marked for observational training. The same month, a clerical assistant at the Northern Oversight Branch compiled a log of incomplete compound life cycle reports from the previous year. These were files submitted without final exposure outcome, typically due to equipment malfunction, technician transfer, or participant withdrawal. Among these, 3 reports were tied to adjacent pilot properties that had received synchronized deliveries with Langston. Each report included a termination date prior to the Langston closure, but referenced unverified dosage sequences extending into the first week of November. The lack of official confirmation led the assistant to include a supplemental note, suggesting that unresolved rotations may have originated upstream, a cautious phrasing used in cases where primary documentation had been sealed. Meanwhile, in the Technical Review Division, a secondary audit process known as schedule reconciliation was underway. This process involved comparing projected versus actual usage intervals for compound-sensitive equipment, with an emphasis on outlier calibration gaps. During one such review, a supervisor located a 15-day variance in the tower alignment register associated with Langston sector equipment. The tower, used for meteorological synchronization, had been due for recalibration on October 15th, but was not re-entered into the master log until December 3rd, 2 weeks after the site's reclassification. The absence was marked superseded by interim record, yet no interim file could be located. The notation stood unverified in the final audit. Other traces of Langston resurfaced sporadically across administrative functions. In October 1891, an inquiry was submitted by a civic registry technician attempting to reconcile residential enumeration data from the previous census cycle. The technician had identified a missing household entry corresponding to the Langston property's last known registration date. The household had been listed under a split jurisdiction designation, giving responsibility for documentation to both the township and the regional agricultural authority. Neither office could produce the final enumeration record. A placeholder form existed in township archives, bearing only the initials EL and an address code for the compound rotation site. The field labeled residency status was left blank. The technician's inquiry was closed without escalation, citing jurisdictional boundary ambiguity. However, the missing enumeration record was listed among the audit flag summary issued to the District Census Board. In that summary, it appears as Item 8 of 12 under the Record Continuity Failure heading. None of the other items listed involved pilot participants or chemically monitored zones. Langston was the only entry marked with both agricultural and residential designations. Shortly afterward, an interdepartmental communication from the Regional Environmental Calibration Unit identified an undocumented atmospheric distortion recorded near the southeastern quadrant of Langston Township. The distortion, measured by a free drift barometric capsule launched on November 10, 1890, had been stored in inactive files due to missing location confirmation. When revisited during an instrumentation control training exercise in late 1891, the capsule's telemetry data showed abrupt vertical displacement inconsistent with wind pattern records from the same hour. The capsule had been part of a general equipment verification launch and not assigned to a specific monitoring operation. Upon reanalysis, the data stream from the capsule indicated an acceleration vector consistent with artificial draft or thermal upwelling. The recording segment lasted for 38 seconds, after which telemetry ceased. The capsule was never recovered. A trainee technician, unaware of its relevance, transcribed the data into a control variable chart later used for training purposes. That chart circulated briefly among regional bureaus before being flagged for redundancy. A clerk preparing the training materials noticed that the time of signal loss coincided precisely with the documented end of Langston atmospheric reporting. No follow-up was pursued, but the clerk appended a note reading signal congruence unknown. Elsewhere in state documentation, a temporary revision in field agent reporting thresholds was issued during the first quarter of 1892. Among the revisions was a clause limiting the detail required in auxiliary participant logs for parcels that had received non-standard material batches. This clause, identified as 4. 2b permitted evaluators to classify certain input anomalies as non-persistent, without full documentation, provided prior compound behavior suggested low propagation risk. The Langston compounds, due to their unique rotation record, fell within the scope of this revision. As a result, several test sites adjacent to Langston filed abbreviated rotation summaries for the 1891 winter cycle, omitting full decay observation. A procedural analyst, during a late-stage consistency check, highlighted that this exemption clause had only been used 7 times across the corridor and that 5 of those uses occurred within parcels sharing Langston's delivery schedule. The analyst filed a note suggesting a review of input traceability, but no corrective action was taken. The revision remained in effect through the end of the pilot program and was not renewed in the subsequent procedural handbook. Throughout this period, no new references to the Langston brothers appeared in operational records. Their identities, once included in routing instructions, internal memoranda, and oversight scheduling, were now absent from all state-level documentation. Their assigned participant codes remained inactive, preserved only within archived audit logs not accessible to township review. Equipment formerly registered to their property was either decommissioned, relabeled for training use, or relocated to conservation inventory storage without reassignment. The parcel itself remained uninhabited, its data tower disconnected but structurally intact. By the end of 1892, all references to Langston in active files had been replaced by administrative placeholders. Compound lots formerly routed through Langston were now assigned to redistributed parcels across multiple counties, and no central record retained the linkage between shipment sequence and field response. a memo issued by the Regional Logistics Coordinator that December closed the final outstanding delivery discrepancy related to the Langston registry, citing non-retrievable archival constraints. By early 1893, the Langston property was no longer referenced in any official capacity within the Agricultural Coordination Network. The parcel remained legally registered under state conservation zoning, but did not appear in circulation maps or inventory rotas. The sample shed, outer fields, and calibration towers had not been dismantled. Instead, all known access routes were removed from regional cartography and replaced with border markers reflecting environmental preservation status. These markers were standardized across unused parcels and bore no identifiers specific to prior activity. Inquiries made by external offices regarding Langston's legacy data were uniformly redirected to the Jefferson County Archival Gate, where all materials had been assigned low-rotation classification. Under this designation, documents could be retrieved only through formal cross-departmental request, and only if linked to an open procedural review. Since no such reviews remained active, the practical effect was complete dormancy. Nevertheless, fragments of the Langston operation continued to influence background policy through indirect retention. A revised training curriculum for compound intake clerks included a short case analysis involving undocumented protocol deviation and compound mislabeling. While the case was anonymized, the sequence of events, shipment intervals, and intake irregularities mirrored those recorded in Langston's final months. No connection was drawn in the training materials, but internal footnotes cite source documents from the same storage drawer as the Langston brothers' inventory logs. The anonymized case was used primarily to illustrate the procedural consequences of unverified compound exchange. In discussion notes accompanying the exercise, trainers instructed new clerks to identify 3 potential reconciliation paths based on chain of custody principles. One of these paths included procedural deferral, an option rarely used in practice, and originally applied to Langston shipment disputes. Though trainees were not told the case's origin, clerical staff noted an increase in questions about parcels that no longer showed on district route maps. Separately, a technician reassigned from Langston perimeter calibration began compiling a personal index of instrumentation records still held in low-access drawers. Among these were atmospheric drift logs from September through November 1890. Though no longer under active review, the technician observed a compression pattern in barometric readings taken from the Langston relay tower, with 7 of the final 11 entries clustering within a substandard tolerance range. This phenomenon had not been documented elsewhere in the region. The technician annotated the files with a notation used to denote calibration sync anomalies, but did not submit the observation into official channels. The annotated copies were retained in a personal study folder. The technician's folder also contained a partial tracing of signal reception logs from a series of auxiliary relay stations. While most were consistent with expected drift margins, one subset of readings from October 29th showed a brief signal overlap that extended across 2 non-adjacent fields. The fields in question were not listed as co-monitored zones, and no shared infrastructure existed between them. The signal overlap lasted 14 minutes and then ceased. The source could not be triangulated using standard relay identifiers. The technician's notes speculate that a third signal origin may have interfered with reception. No support for this interpretation was found in adjacent relay logs. Still, the chart was later used as an instructional example in a training session held for junior analysts. Its inclusion was attributed to signal discipline awareness, and the origin of the overlap was not explored further. Elsewhere, the Jefferson County Bureau undertook a consolidation of its archive index in preparation for a shift in procedural taxonomy. During this process, file drawers were relabeled according to updated classification codes. The Langston folder was relabeled to reflect its closure date and reassigned a numeric-only identifier. The previous title, Langston Agricultural Participant Record, EBS, was removed, and the drawer front was marked with a non-descriptive code sequence. Inside the folder, all personnel logs, inventory registers, and correspondence entries were retained in their original configuration, However, a new reference sheet was inserted at the front of the drawer. The sheet listed 5 subordinate folders within the file and categorized them by procedural topic rather than participant identity. The reclassification did not eliminate any content, but made access dependent on knowledge of the new index system. As a result, those seeking information about Langston under legacy labels would find no pathway into the file. At the same time, the township office in Langston was instructed to reduce redundant inventory forms stored in auxiliary buildings. A former field clerk, now assigned to document triage, discovered an unsigned compound tracking chart filed among miscellaneous supply sheets. The chart contained no participant identifiers, but showed a series of exposure intervals consistent with Langston's last recorded test cycle. Annotations along the margin corresponded to known compound identifiers from the October 1890 manifest. A local administrator confirmed that no other property had used that sequence. The tracking chart was not refiled with the Langston record, but preserved under the supply office's inactive training folder. It remained there unreferenced until the office transitioned to full civic services in 1894. At that point, all remaining agricultural records were boxed and relocated to a shared warehouse, where they were indexed by acquisition date rather than origin. The chart was logged under the box's general contents as exposure durations unidentified parcel. Meanwhile, one of the remaining visual records of the Langston property, a 6-plate balloon image series, was reprinted for use in a landscape preservation training module. The plates, originally flagged for visual artifacts, were not marked with geographic coordinates. The training module used them to highlight soil compression patterns and fencing decay. A footnote on slide 3 identifies the site as an unnamed conservation parcel. No reference to prior program participation is made. By 1895, all known surface indicators connecting the Langston brothers to their former residence had been removed or decayed. The sample shed, though still standing, had lost its external signage due to wind and mineral wear. The wire fencing surrounding the property had been dismantled during a state initiative to recover surplus materials. The calibration towers, while structurally sound, had ceased to transmit and were delisted from the regional grid. Occasional queries continued to arrive at the regional office regarding long-term compound behavior in discontinued test parcels. These inquiries, often submitted by academic affiliates or adjacent program participants, were answered with form letters referring the matter to the county archive. In each case, no data from the Langston parcel was provided. If a requester referenced the Langston site by name, the response was standard: no active participant by that designation. The absence of clarification, combined with the removal of visible reference points, produced a gradual loss of institutional memory. Within 4 years, the Langston brothers ceased to appear in training materials, correspondence examples, or equipment handling case studies. Their entries in compound intake registries were absorbed into block inventories. The ledger of unsubmitted participant surveys no longer bore their initials. Their final logbook, held under seal, was placed into permanent storage. The final administrative occurrence linked to the Langston case did not appear in a state record or program ledger. Instead, it surfaced during a transition audit conducted by an independent reviewer, contracted to prepare the Jefferson County Archival District for a regional consolidation. As part of the audit, each drawer within the low-access inventory was opened, sampled, and re-indexed. In one compartment labeled under Environmental Procedures, the reviewer located a sealed folder without a category stamp. Inside were 3 folded paper logs, a partial field intake chart, and a note written on official township stationery. The note read, "Filed outside sequence, returned unread." The paper logs were written in small graphite lettering and included abbreviated entries referencing soil displacement, compound residue, and instrument interference. No participants were named, and the sheets bore no Clark stamp. However, each log began with a date aligning with the final 3 days of recorded Langston Tower transmission. The reviewer flagged the folder as misfiled and passed it to the audit supervisor. Upon examination, the supervisor recorded the contents under a temporary inventory placeholder and filed a separate report citing unidentified residuals in retired zone documentation. The report was received, but not incorporated into the consolidation matrix. Instead, the folder was returned to storage with a new index tag indicating its non-affiliated status. In the updated catalog, the file appeared between procedural bulletins unrelated to pilot operations. Its sequence number did not correspond to any open file set, and no follow-up request was filed. The supervisor who submitted the report retired at the end of that quarter. Subsequent inspection of the Jefferson County Archive shows that by mid-1896, over 60% of field materials from the Langston Initiative had either been destroyed, redistributed, or reclassified under broader environmental protocols. No record exists indicating which agency authorized the destruction, but shipment logs show 5 crates bearing inactive field tags were removed from the depot and delivered to a regional disposal center. The tags match a lot code assigned to Langston's perimeter calibration site. The center's intake form simply lists expired instruments and includes no origin code. The loss of these materials was not contested. Most pilot program documents had reached their retention limit and were eligible for reprocessing or incineration. Once removed from circulation, they could not be reinstated without direct authorization from a supervisory entity. None was requested. In the absence of an active file, future mentions of Langston were limited to footnotes within inactive annexes. Clerks who had participated in the program had moved to unrelated departments or left public service. The Langston program, though never formally closed, was now treated as dormant by default. Years later, a land surveyor compiling slope deviation charts for state hydrology planning noted a rectangular boundary zone in Langston Township where elevation data could not be verified. The area, once the core of the Langston parcel, appeared blank on all topographic overlays. The surveyor filed a notation indicating that the surface mapping had been excluded due to restricted zone designation, though no restriction order had been entered into the planning register. When cross-checked against agricultural zoning charts, the parcel bore no overlay and was listed under an unclaimed lot code. Despite this, a secondary system used to track soil stabilization efforts continued to reference the parcel indirectly. Annual runoff simulations included a parameter adjustment based on localized absorption anomalies recorded in the southeastern section of Langston Township. These simulations, while automated, drew from legacy hydrological data that had not been updated since the final years of the Langston pilot. The anomaly variable, identified as coefficient D, was never removed from simulation protocols. Its presence ensured that, even without formal designation, the Langston parcel influenced ongoing predictive models. One of the last known references to the Langston property appeared in a printed appendix attached to a state advisory circular on programmatic oversight. The appendix listed former pilot parcels that had experienced anomalous reporting or unverified protocol divergence. The list contained only numerical entries, each corresponding to decommissioned fields. Entry number 19 was annotated with a marginal asterisk indicating that final review had not been completed due to jurisdictional closure. The entry aligned with Langston's field code. No additional entries followed. The circular, published without attribution, was distributed only to internal offices and never archived for public access. Its existence was not referenced in future procedural documents, and the field codes were not cross-referenced with active lot identifiers. By 1899, the Langston site had passed from functional memory. Maps no longer included its structure, protocols did not list its cases, inventories did not trace its deliveries. The perimeter remained uninhabited, and the parcel remained untended. The fencing was gone, the signage was unmounted, the tools were relocated, the soil was not sampled. Yet the placeholder logs were never deleted. The null entries remained. The database retained their absence. The chart coordinates showed space where classification had once been. And the registry of compound lot designations, though updated, never reused the codes assigned to the Langston brothers. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget. But we insist on remembering. This story was taken from documents that were found. All names have been edited to protect the source.